Well, hello again everybody, and I'm hoping today is going to be the final episode of our master radio, because I promised you last time that we were going to have a go at replacing this resistive dropper with what they call a wattless dropper using a capacitor. But before we do that, let's just have a quick look at what we've got here. So as I'm hoping you can see, we've just gone ahead and I've drawn up a little bit of a sketch here. This is really the power supply arrangement of our radio. So you can see that we've got these two big resistors here. Well, that's these two 300 ohm resistors. Now previously these two resistors are what was installed in that resistive line cord that we cut off, and because we're actually pulling quite a bit of current through here, we're actually going to find that these two resistors get hot, and they actually get surprisingly hot. Now you can see that the arrangement we've got, effectively the two 300 ohm resistors, they're in series, and they're going to limit the current going into our valves and our lamp here. So we've got a lamp and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 valves. They're going to limit that current in theory to about 150 milliamps. But you can also see that at the centre point here of the two resistors, what we're also doing, we're taking off a wire from the centre point, and we feed that to our rectifier valve here. And well, I'm a little bit worried about this arrangement actually, because at some point I'm going to try to replace these resistors with capacitors, and I do have a concern that this pulse current here, with it being a half wave rectifiers, it might negatively affect our wattless dropper. And of course a wattless dropper is just another name that they give to capacitive droppers. So I think before we go any further and get into doing the calculations and stuff like that, I would be interested in just doing a little bit of a benchmarking exercise, just measure some of the currents and voltages around this radio, and before we go ahead and we change this for a capacitor, because I've never worked on one of these before, so I'm always just a bit of an interest to take a look under the hood and see if we can learn anything. So I think one of the things I'm most interested in is I want to know how much current here is going through these two resistors, and I want to know how hot they're getting, and I want to know what the power dissipation is. I'm fairly sure that we wouldn't be able to put these two resistors within our radio cabinet. There's just too much power dissipated in them, they're getting too hot. But let's get a figure for that power dissipation. Let's go ahead and do that. Now I do actually realise that in last week's video I actually made a little bit of a mistake, because I think I calculated it roughly and actually assumed that the same current was running through both of these 300 ohm resistors, which is actually wrong. I made a mistake there, because as you can see it's actually clearly got a centre tap. So the centre tap point here goes to feed our half wave rectifier, and you can see I've actually drawn the current in there, and because it's a half wave rectifier it's only going to pull current on one half of the main cycle. So what I actually neglected was that I assumed that the same current was actually going through the top 300 ohm resistor as the bottom one, and that's not true, because a proportion of the total current is going to go through here to feed our rectifier. So there's going to be a little bit less current getting down here, getting into our radio. So what I think we'll do is we'll measure the voltage across both of these two resistors. We'll measure the voltages separately, and that'll give a wattage figure for that resistor, and then we'll get a wattage figure for that one. If we add them together, that's the total wattage that's being dissipated in these two resistors. And of course the formula that we're going to use for that, that's V squared over R. Okay, 230.9, that's close enough. And let's see if we can measure some voltage across these resistors. Now I don't think the radio's switched on, so we better turn it on, hadn't we? Of course now we've turned it on, that voltage is shooting up. Now I'm going to give this a moment, because everything's got to warm up. The valve heaters need to start to conduct fully, or we're not going to start rectifying our DC and drawing DC off it. So let's just give it 5 minutes, everything to warm up, and then we'll take the voltage measurements. You can hear we've got a bit of tuning action there.
That's when he said to me, when the ball breaks in that box, I need you to be the force to get on the end of it, get a little toe poke, just a little...
Okay, so I've left this about 5 minutes, and I'm going ahead and I'm going to write down our voltage here, which is across the top of our potential divider, and that's 76.4 volts. And now let's measure the voltage across the bottom pair, which I think will be these two. Can we get that on there? Which is 49.6. So across the top of our potential divider here we had 76 volts, and across the bottom resistor we had 49 volts. Now both these resistance values are the same, they're both around 300 ohms, not exactly, but they're around 300 ohms. So I can just tell that we've got, because we're dropping more voltage across this resistor, this one has got more current going across it for the same value of resistance. So the top resistor has more current than the bottom resistor, and of course we would expect that because some of that current is going into our rectifier. It's taking a route down here into our rectifier, and whatever's left is going down here to feed each of these series filaments. So let's just look at the wattage dissipated in this first one. So the calculation that we're simply going to do, we're going to do V squared over R, so V squared 76.4 squared over 300 ohms, 76.4 squared, divide that by R, which is 300, and that gives us 19.45 watts. 19.4 watts in our top resistor. Let's have a look at the bottom one now. Same again, so 49.6 squared, and we're going to divide that again by 300. That equals 8.2 watts. 8.2 watts. So 19 watts is being dissipated in this top resistor, but there's a lot less wattage being dissipated in this bottom one. The total wattage, all we've got to do is basically just add them together. So 8.2 we've already got on the calculator, plus 19.4 watts. So the total amount of power that's being dissipated in both these resistors here is a total of 27 watts. 27 watts. So I've just gone ahead and I've plugged our radio in again and allowed it to warm up, and let's just look at our energy monitoring plug here, and let's just put it on watts, which is there, and it's actually telling us that this whole radio, it's consuming 48 watts. So we'll just make a note of that. So the radio is consuming 48 watts, and we said earlier that the total power being dissipated in these resistors was 27 watts. So really, this whole 27 watts that we've got here, it's doing absolutely nothing useful. It's just going up the chimney. So basically half the power out of the 48 watts that we're supplying, 27 of it is going straight up the chimney. It's not doing any useful work. I mean, the useful work here is that's actually going into our radio. What's that? It's about 21 watts, isn't it? We've got about 21 watts of useful power, which is actually heating up these valve filaments and supplying our B+, our power to provide our B+. So we've got that. That's about 21 watts of useful energy, but we've actually got 27 watts that's just going straight up the chimney. It's not doing any good whatsoever, and we're paying for that. But I'm not concerned about what it's cost. What I'm actually concerned about is well, I'm concerned about how to get rid of that heat, because ow, ow, ooh, ow. Well, if I touch them resistors, they're hot. In fact, one of the resistors is an awful lot hotter than the other. So in theory we can just prove that one of these resistors is dissipating a lot more current than the other by just actually putting this thermocouple probe on it. So this is the top of our potential divider. So this resistor here is carrying the most current. So this one is actually set at it's about 121 degrees at the moment. Let's go on the low resistor. It's settling down. That's about 91 degrees. 92. So it looks like we've actually basically got around 30 degrees of difference between these two resistors, and that is quite noticeable. Now just before I go ahead and I build our wattless dropper, I thought I'd just like to take a look at some of the currents in the radio. So what we're going to find is we're going to be feeding the radio with AC mains. So of course that's a sine wave which I've drawn here, and that's symmetrical. And what I mean by that, I mean the top of the sine wave, it's as high as the bottom half of the sine wave. They're actually drawn symmetrical to each other. Now that won't be the case in real life, and the reason it won't be the case in real life is because this is the actual rectifier here. So the rectifier, because it's a half wave rectifier, it's only drawing current on half of the waveform. So you see the bottom half of the waveform here, I'm showing that as nothing because it won't be conducting. The rectifier isn't conducting, it's only conducting on the top half. So what that actually means is that will affect this. We'll probably find that this incoming supply will actually be slightly distorted. It will be, I don't know which way around it'll be, but it'll be higher at one side than the other because it will be drawing more current. So the current that's being supplied to our heater valves, actually the same current will be drawn on the negative half cycle as is for the positive half cycle, but because we've got this rectifier here, this is only drawing power on half of the half cycle. So what you're going to find is it will result in the currents being asymmetric from here. Now that could be important because it could cause a problem when we go ahead and try to replace these capacitors with resistors, and it's something which is often seems to be neglected because a lot of the formulas and calculations, they assume that you've got a nice sine wave, and we will see that we haven't got a beautifully nice sine wave. So let's just take a look at the current that's actually being supplied to our heater filaments. So we can see that it's got a little bit of distortion, but that's not a bad sine wave. I suspect as much as anything that's noise on my incoming mains. Quite interesting to see where this noise occurs. Of course, I'm in a modern house with lots of switchboard power supplies and stuff like that. So you would expect, you don't get a perfect sine wave, you get little bits of distortion, which is generally caused by just too many switch mode power supplies all attached to your mains. But you can see it's reasonably symmetrical there. So let's go ahead, let's have a look at now the current which is flowing into our rectifier. So of course, as expected, our rectifier valve here, it's actually only conducting, it's only drawing current on one half cycle, it's not drawing it over the full mains cycle. And of course, actually that causes mains distortion as well. If everybody was to draw only half power over half the cycle of the mains, you would find that ultimately that would lead to distortion of your mains in your house, because you know the electricity board, they want you to draw power on the full mains cycle, not half of it like this. So what we'll find is if we actually add up the current which is being fed to our heaters with the current that's being fed to our B plus, to our rectifier, you'll find that that will produce what is a little bit of a distorted waveform. So I'm just going to go on the neutral return line now, so let me do that. And it's slightly gone off scale, but you can see that the centre point of the waveform here, that should be the middle here. Now you can see that the bottom is it's about 1 centimetre, it's one division from the bottom, but the top of the waveform now is actually off scale. So you can see that this valve radio, it's pulling much more current on the positive half cycle of the mains cycle than it is the negative half cycle. So more current is being consumed, it's consuming more energy, more power on the positive half cycle than it is on the negative half cycle. And I just think that it's interesting to see and consider that. Now of course that won't be the same for actually all valve radios, because in a lot of valve radios you will find a full wave rectifier. If it was a full wave rectifier, it would effectively pull the same amount of current on the positive half of the main cycle as the negative, and this would then look symmetrical. So this problem is being caused by the fact we're using a half wave rectifier. Well, it was about 10 years ago now. I was driving along Siltstone Road to my favourite hardware store, and I approached this junction here, Now, I was actually going relatively slowly. Back at that time, I think this road was a 60-mile limit. I think I was probably doing about 40 miles an hour. And I was approaching this junction. As you can see, I would have had the right of way. But as I approached this junction, I could see that there was a car sat here. As you can see, there was a car in this position. Now, have you ever been in that position where you get the spider sense and the hair stands up on the back of your neck? Well, that's what happened to me, and everything went into slow motion. And basically the point I was trying to make is, even though I saw it coming, I was unable to avoid the accident. I could see the accident coming. I was trying the brakes, trying the steering wheel. I still ended up running into the side of this car here that had just pulled out in front of me. Now, if you're wondering why I'm telling you this story now, it's because I could see an accident approaching. I could see the car crash on its way, and although I tried to do everything I could in my power to stop it happening, I couldn't. Now, this is really what I think about putting these capacitive droppers in radios. You can do it, but I think it's rarely very successful. I think it's going to be particularly unsuccessful in this case. Well, I think I've probably explained in this video about 100 times already the problem with these resistive line cords, and also the problem with just trying to replace them with power resistors, because the power resistors are going to get very hot and we won't be able to contain that much heat within our little tiny radio cabinet. So what's the alternative? Well, in the first of my circuits here, you can see we've got an ammeter, and that's represented by this circle with the letter A in it. And this ammeter, it's just connected directly to a 240 volt mains supply. Now, what would happen if we took an ammeter and connected it to a mains supply? Well, basically what would happen is there would be no components in circuit that would control the current to our ammeter. So basically your ammeter, it's going to have a very bad day. The needle is going to wang across, wrap itself around the end stop, and it's never going to work again because there's no way to limit the current. Now, if we connected our 240 volt supply directly to the heaters of our valves, they would do very much the same thing. They'd light up very, very brightly like light bulbs, but for a very short time. That's no good. We can't connect our valves directly to the mains because they're going to light up like light bulbs, or we're going to blow up our ammeter. So we need another plan to limit our current. So I've got another circuit here. We've got the same 240 volt power supply, we've got an ammeter, but this time we've got a resistor which has been placed in series with our ammeter. So what will happen is this resistor will actually limit the current which is flowing in our circuit. So hopefully when we switch the power on, our ammeter won't explode. Now, we can quite easily work out how much this resistor will limit the current. So I've said that our resistor is 680 ohms. We can use Ohm's law, so current A for amps equals V over R. So we take 240, we divide it by 680 ohms, and that will give us 0.35 amps. So the little ammeter will indicate 0.35 amps on it. Everybody's happy. But of course you will know by now that our 680 ohm resistor, that's doing a great job of limiting the current, but at the expense of power dissipation. This resistor is going to get hot. Now we can work out how hot it's going to get. Again, very simply, we can do I, which is current, times V, bugger. Okay, don't know where the R came from. Edit that out, nobody will ever know. Okay, so the formula for power is I times V, so current times volts. So if we take our current, which is 0.35 amps, times it by 240, that gives us a total of 84 watts. Well, 84 watts, that's equivalent, that's almost like having a 100 watt bulb. And again, I've also said if you've ever grabbed hold of a 100 watt bulb, you'll know how much it burns your fingers. So this 680 ohm resistor, it's going to limit our current to 0.35 amps, but at the expense of getting damn hot.
Scorchio.
So moving on to our next circuit here, you can see this time we've got the same 240 volt supply. There's our ammeter, and I've also got a 4.7 microfarad capacitor. Now unfortunately we're going to have to again do a little bit more maths. There is a formula which you should be aware of, and the formula is 1 over 2 pi FC. Now there is a special case of resistance which only applies to AC circuits, and they call that reactance. There's two types of reactance. There's one that happens in capacitor circuits, that's called capacitive reactance, and there's one that only occurs in inductive circuits that have coils of wire in them. Amazingly enough, that's called inductive reactance. But it works very, very much like DC resistance does. It has the same values, it's measured in ohms, but really what affects the resistance is the frequency. So again, the formula for a capacitor is 1 over 2 pi fc. So when we build a capacitive dropper, what we're trying to do is we're trying to replace the resistor with an equivalent reactance. So I've done the formula again here, 1 over 2 pi fc. So what we do is we take 2 times pi times 50, so that's 50 hertz. The mains frequency is important. We times that by 0.47 microfarad. Amazingly enough, that comes out as 680 ohms, and if we put a 680 ohms resistor in circuit, we can do V over R this time, and that will produce 0.35 amps. So effectively this capacitor is going to do exactly the same thing as our resistor, but the interesting thing about this capacitor, it's going to stay cold, it's not going to get hot. Well, I'm sure just having taken a look at capacitive reactance, 3 important questions come to mind. Firstly, how much longer will this video go on? Secondly, why is there so much pointing happening? Well, I'm afraid I don't have good answers for any of those questions, but for number 3 I can just have a go at making something up, so here we go. Now, as we saw earlier in the case of our resistor, it was getting hot as a result of the power that was being dissipated in it. And this time I've got the formula right, that power equals voltage times current. Oh, that's one of the many ways you can calculate power anyway. Voltage times current equals power. Let's take a look at our resistor first and see how the power is developed in it. So as most of you will know, the electrical power that comes out of your wall socket, it's in the shape of a sine wave, and I've got that sine wave drawn in blue here. Now this is just one cycle of a sine wave. If you're in England, you'll get 50 of these sine waves occurring every second. In America, they have a slightly higher frequency. They get 60 of these sine waves every second. But in the UK, for us, it's 50. So in blue here, we've got the voltage plotted, and you can see that the voltage goes up positive to a peak, and then it goes down to the minus point, and then the voltage reverses, it goes negative, and then it starts to rise back up positive again. So that's the voltage that we have drawn in blue, and then I've actually got the current here, which is drawn in red. Now you can see that for our resistor here, the voltage and the current, they're what they call it in phase. You can see that as the voltage rises in blue, the current rises in red. Now you can also hear the voltage crosses through 0 and goes negative, and again the current just follows it. It goes negative and then it comes back up. So both the voltage and the current, they call this being in phase. They match each other precisely like synchronized dancers. So I think just to demonstrate why a resistor gets hot and dissipates power and a capacitor doesn't, we've got to go back to our formula, and we're going to go voltage times current. So all I'm going to do is I'm just going to very, very roughly add these together. Well, basically I'm going to multiply them together. So you'll have to remember a little bit of maths about minus and positive numbers. So again, if we take a positive voltage and a positive current, so that's positive multiplied by positive, well that's going to equal something that's positive, isn't it? Now the second quadrant here, the voltage is still positive and the current is still positive, so that's positive multiplied by something that's positive, that equals positive. Now of course we go to the minus side where the voltage reverses, so the voltage is negative here, and we're going to multiply that by the current, which is also negative, and if you remember, negative times negative equals positive, and then we're just going to do the same thing for the last quadrant. Negative times negative is positive. So we have positive, 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 positive. We've got 4 positives. They all add up together. So positive, that's power. So let's just take a look at our capacitor now. Now we can see that we've got the same sine wave here of voltage. That looks just the same as it did for our resistor, but our current looks a little bit odd. If you can see, our current actually reaches a maximum value before the voltage reaches its maximum voltage. And if you look at the numbers I've got drawn down the bottom, it goes 0, 90, 180, 270, 360. What you would say is the voltage and the current, they're separated by 90 degrees. That's how far they are apart. So this is the problem that you have. Well, it's not a problem, this is a fact. Whenever you get voltages and currents going through capacitors, they're no longer in phase with each other, they're not in step. It's kind of like they're still doing a dance, and they're both doing the same dance, i.e. they're both tracing sine wave shapes, but one dancer is a couple of dance moves in front of the other. So what we say about that is the current is in front of the voltage. The current is in front of it, it's leading. That's a phrase that they use. The current is leading the voltage by 90 degrees, and that's just a fundamental of when you put voltage and current through capacitors. So let's do the same multiplication of both the voltage and the current, and we're going to find something a little bit odd happens. So we start at the starting point here. Our voltage is a positive number and our current is also a positive number. It's on the positive side of the graph. So positive multiplied by positive equals a positive result. Let's look at the second quadrant. Now our current has gone negative, so that's negative, but our voltage is still positive. So a positive number multiplied by a negative number is a negative number. Let's look at the third quadrant. The voltage has gone negative now, and actually our current is also negative. So we've got a negative number multiplied by a negative number. Well, amazingly enough, that equals a positive number. And then the final one here, we've got the voltage is negative, the current is positive, so multiply a negative number by a positive number and we get a negative number, don't we? So I'm just going to summarise these signs at the bottom. So we have positive, negative, positive and negative again. And of course the sum of all those, if we add them up, you know, positive plus a negative, positive plus a negative, we actually end up with 0. So this is why there is 0 power being developed within our capacitor. That's why it's not getting hot, because it doesn't dissipate any power. So the next thing that I plan to do today is I'm going to work out the value of capacitor that we need to actually limit the current which is flowing through our valve filaments. We need to limit it to about 150 milliamps. Now the way that we would do that is, I'm afraid we've got to do some more maths, and the maths is just a little bit complicated, and the reason it's so complicated is because of this relationship between the voltage and the current. With them being out of phase with each other, you can't actually just multiply the voltages and the currents and divide voltage by current using standard Ohm's law. You've got to modify it. In the calculation you have to take into respect this 90 degrees phase shift, and as I say, that just makes the maths a little bit tricky. Now there's a number of ways you can do it. You can do it using Pythagoras' theorem. You can do it using something called complex numbers, which is probably how I would do it. And the third way you can do it is using something called phasor diagrams, where you take into account this phase relationship. Now, rather than doing a load of J notation and, you know, the square root of -1, all that good stuff, I thought I would just show you how to do it using phasor diagrams. But I'm not going to dwell on it. It's only going to be about 10 seconds. I just fast forward through it. If you want to know more details, you can always ask me, or you can slow it down the video and take a look for yourself. So I promise that's the end of the maths for this video, and hopefully an end to me just waffling on boringly. So let's go ahead and work out what value of capacitor we need. Now, without wanting to mix my metaphors anymore, this is a point in the proceedings where the car crash finally came home to roost. So you can see I've gone ahead and we've got our capacitors here, and we've got them. We've got this installed in this this dubious box of electrical safety. Don't worry, it's a category 3 cardboard box, so what could go wrong with that? That will be fine. But I made some really big cock-ups here, and it all went horribly wrong. So let me show you. Well, let's introduce Mr. Pokey Stick again. So here's the circuit that we started with our two 300 ohm resistors. So that was getting very hot, so we came up for a bit of a cure and we decided to be smart and fit capacitors. So here's our capacitor, which is 2.3 microfarads. Now, here's one of my mistakes in that if we look here, we've got these two resistors and the centre tapped, and I'd kind of made the assumption that the total current that was going through here was 150 milliamps, and I don't know why I thought that, because I measured it and I proved it wasn't the case earlier, because of course we've got some current going down here through this resistor, which is 150 milliamps, but we've also got quite a bit of current coming down this branch into our rectifier diode. So that was a cock-up in that this value of capacitance that I actually worked out, it was wrong, because it would have limited the current too much. It would have supplied the valve heaters, but it wouldn't have supplied enough current for the rectifier here, so the actual voltage would fall. So that was no good. That was a mistake. I didn't spot it, didn't see it coming until after I'd done the maths, and yeah, mistake number one. But mistake number two here is I kind of also did think what we could do here is we could kind of replicate the centre tapped arrangement using capacitors. Now that totally failed to work for a number of reasons that weren't exactly obvious to me, so I think rather to just talk about that, it's easier just to show you. But you can see that we've gone up from 2.3 microfarads to 4.7, and the reason we did that, of course, is because when we put two capacitors in series, unlike resistors, the actual value halves. So to maintain the same 2.3 microfarads, you have to double the value, so that brings out about 4.7. So that's why I did that, but this circuit absolutely did not work. I thought I was being so smart, and I actually fell on my big fat bum. As you can see, we've got our radio set up on the bench again. We've got a meter here which is set to volts, and we've also got a little current clamp meter in circuit. So this current clamp meter, this is monitoring the current which is actually going to the heater supply. So let me just switch that on because it's turned itself off. So that's on the 200 milliamp range. I doubt you'll be able to see that, but that is there. Let's put some power on. Okay, so at the moment we've got 240 volts going into our bank of capacitors here, so that's the mains input that we're looking at. Let me just find another connection point on here. So there we're on the centre tap point now of both our capacitors, and we've got 139 volts, so that wouldn't be bad to feed our HT rectifier with. It's a little bit high, but I'm sure we could work with that. Now let's look at the output voltage here from our last capacitor. Now this actual reading is actually a little bit low. We were aiming for about 112 volts, but we've actually only got 88 volts. We could probably do with a higher value of capacitor in that location to lift that voltage up a little bit, but the current isn't too bad. We're actually at 136 milliamps. Ideally we'd be at 150, but this isn't an exact science. Valve heaters, they're very, very forgiving. The reality is 10 volts either way is probably not going to make a lot of difference. 20 volts probably isn't going to make a lot of difference either. But it would have still worked, but we could have gone a little bit higher. Now I was actually being quite careful because I said to you before, my voltage input here, it isn't 230 volts or 240, it's 250. So I'm going to go and set, using the variac, my actual mains input voltage because it's still a little bit low. So I'm going to go up now to about 250. So our outputs come up a little bit more, 94 volts, and our current is 142 milliamps. Our heaters are actually glowing nicely. I can't turn the radio over right now, but I promise you they're glowing nicely. So this capacitor is doing exactly what it should do, and if I touch these, they're totally cold now. And even if I put my finger on the anti-surge resistor that we've got tucked into there, which I'm not going to do because it's live, but that's running very cool. So good, that's a success. But here's where the problem occurs, and it was quite a big problem. Let me just go back to the centre tap of this bank of capacitors. So there you go, you can see 148 volts. So this centre point here, this is where I was actually going to feed my rectifier from. And it just so happens I've got the wire that comes from our rectifier here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to connect up our rectifier. And of course now we've got the valves are all lit up, the filaments are hot. So if I connect this to the centre point with its 148 AC volts, this radio is going to spring into life because it's going to rectify that 148 volts. It's going to power the radio. So let me prove that. Oh. Well, I can't hear anything. Let me turn the volume up. Well, how can that not work? I know my rectifier is good. We've got 148 volts. It doesn't work. I know, let's go on to a lower voltage here. Let's go just take our voltage to our rectifier from our valves. Well, that doesn't make sense, does it? This is a lower voltage point. We've got 147 volts here. Let's just measure the other voltage. So we've only got 100 volts here. Well, what's going on? Well, you know what? This had me flummoxed. I didn't know the answer. So I actually had to go on the vintage radio restoration forum, and I had to ask some of the old greybeards on there, and they actually pointed out that I was an idiot. And of course this circuit would never work. But let me show you what's actually happening, because I think it's really interesting. We've got two voltmeters set up on the bench now. So the one on the left here, this is set up to show DC volts, and the one on the right is set up to show AC volts. Now both of these meters, they're actually connected here to the centre point of our capacitor. So you actually see that the DC voltmeter, the one on the left here, it's showing 0 because you know, it's a capacitor. This is effectively, we've got a DC blocking capacitor on either side of the centre tap, so we probably wouldn't be expecting to see any DC, and of course we don't, whereas we actually do see a nice AC voltage there of 142 volts. But something quite curious happens when we actually try to just connect up our rectifier. So I'm just going to connect this to the centre point of these capacitors. Now watch this voltmeter, watch what happens. Okay, did you see it's jumped to minus 200 volts? So we actually need to forward bias this rectifier to make it work. And yeah, it's not going to get really forward biased, is it, with minus 200 volts on it? This rectifier couldn't be more turned off. I didn't immediately realise what was going on here, but of course this is a diode in series with this capacitor. So what's actually happening is that it's actually pulling away the positive half of the main cycle. It's because the diode is only conducting for the positive half of the main cycle, so it's pulling the AC positive cycle off, and what it's leaving back behind, it's leaving the minus behind, and that's the problem. So yeah, this rectifier is being turned off because we've got this big minus DC voltage. I've got to go ahead and I've got to fix some of this. What I'm going to do is we're actually going to do away with these two capacitors because they're no use to us. We can't use the centre point because it produces this minus voltage. But because this rectifier at the moment, it's not running with its original valve rectifier. It's actually running with a diode in it, because you remember in the last episode the actual rectifier didn't work properly, did it? It was something wrong with it. So we've kind of had a little happy accident here. If we actually replace the valve rectifier with a silicon rectifier, it doesn't require as much voltage dropped across it, or it doesn't drop as much voltage across it. So I think that we're going to have more than enough voltage to run this little radio. It doesn't have to be perfect. This isn't my main listening to radio, but hopefully it should work. So I'm going to turn that off before I touch anything and electrocute myself. I'm going to replace that with one single capacitor, and we'll run it up again and see if we do any better.
Scorchio.
Mono estente.